Welcome to This Old Town Collector's Edition with Alan Oren. We'll be traveling back through Long Island history with some encore presentations of This Old Town segments. And this month, we'll be traveling in leisure. We'll slip on the sandals, pack the swimsuit, and rest and relax real hard. It's time to resort to some resorts, and Long Island history is filled with them. In fact, at one point at the turn of the century, Long Island was the spot for vacationers from New York City. Paddle wheelers ran from Manhattan and Brooklyn, and a string of South Shore towns, from Babylon to Montauk, got started as beach resorts. A little later, though, the most famous beach bowed. Its name was common, and so was its appeal. It was Jones Beach, and its start was part of Massapequa history. Drive through Massapequa, and you'll see lots of child's play. And it's natural that family should be its focus, because one family forms the hub of history in this old town. But before that, the origin of the town name, the peaceful Massapequa Indians. Their fate is framed in a sculpture that reads, "Love one another." But the bearer, John Underhill, was a mercenary who specialized in subduing Native Americans, who, you'll notice, plead and bow at right. The other side of his monument is also politically incorrect. Colonists rejoice, while Underhill rides high, lording it over the Massapequa. But the real lords of this realm started with a pirate. Major Thomas Jones was allowed to plunder ships by King James II, whom he fought for. When he tired of that, he took his wife Freelove and settled on 6,000 acres in Massapequa, taking a special liking to the whale hunting on a nearby shore. He created one of the first whaling stations on Long Island there, and he lent his name to a later creation, Jones Beach. When he died, he was buried there, but grave robbers kept digging him up, looking for pirate treasure. So finally, he received a marker, but a final rest in the heart of town. Or was it final? When Jones died in the town's first brick house, a blackbird flew in the upstairs window, which kept blowing open, and was finally bricked over, considered haunted. Then there was the other Thomas Jones, the judge. Pro-English, he was kidnapped from his home during the Revolution by colonists who burst into his drawing room, then exchanged him at sea for a jail general, while Jones's wife, thankful he was well treated, sent this tin of tea to the general's wife, whose family returned it with this letter a century later. A decade later, there was lawyer Sam Jones, who was one of the few who believed New York should join the new United States. His speech is credited with convincing the state. And the Jones family backed church as much as state. In 1844, Elbert Floyd Jones planned Grace Church on Merrick Road. Oh, and one more Jones for the books. This one-room library may be the oldest on Long Island, formed from a private collection in 1896 by Delancey Floyd Jones. So for 297 years, Massapequa history was tied to the Jones family, and an active family it was. It was not easy to keep up with the Joneses. Now, Jones Beach, of course, was the creation of a great builder, Robert Moses, and another beach, slightly to the west, was also the creation of one man. William Reynolds, like Robert Moses, had a vision and built it in sand. Also like Moses, Reynolds and his resort looked to Europe for inspiration. He saw the Riviera and Venice, then he created Long Beach. It is the beach that makes Long Beach, and that made it in the past, but it was a series of smart promoters who made the most of the beach in this old town. The Long Island Railroad tried first, creating a resort so trains could run there. It failed. The man who succeeded spectacularly was William Reynolds at center, the youngest state senator ever and one of the busiest developers and dandies. The man for whom Reynolds Canal was named first founded Bensonhurst, Borough Park, and Brownsville, and still found time for another type of building.
Senator Reynolds was quite a ladies' man, and when he had a girlfriend, he built a house for her, so he'd have some place to go.
Did he build many houses?
A few. I'm not going to commit myself on how many.
Suffice it to say that his portrait in City Hall shows his hands hidden, and legend claims it was because a finger was mangled by an angry husband. And another legend, part of the city seal. When Reynolds was thrown in jail for graft, the town clock was stopped at that very moment, 3:30, and only restarted when he returned to cheering throngs. They cheered because Reynolds built a city from sand, built it with a boardwalk into only the second city in the county, along with Glen Cove. Always the promoter, Reynolds brought elephants from Dreamland, his Brooklyn theme park, to help build. And when he was done, he had a dreamland by the shore, replete with the National Bathing Pavilion and some of the area's finest hotels. He also made sure that town roofs had red tile, as in Europe, so he could market Long Beach as the American Riviera. Later, promoters created canals and called the town the American Venice, giving houses small front yards, small backyards, but big boat yards. They ballyhooed the beach, truly a Long Beach at 3.5 miles, and its recreation value hardly for the birds. They joked about the necking beneath the boardwalk, calling the spot Hotel Underwood, and they joked that the town needed no funeral parlor, it still has none, because it was so healthy, once named America's healthiest town. So if you were a marketing man, Long Beach seemed irresistible, the perfect place to plant a dream. And most surprising, those dreams usually took root. Now, Jones Beach and Long Beach are still popular playgrounds, but worldwide, the island's best-known vacation spots are further east. We will follow that trail to its very end when we return. Please stay with us. For more Long Island history, here are some sites you can visit. The African American Museum focuses on the black experience and contribution. The Cradle of Aviation Museum features aircraft from the start of flight to the space age. Garvey's Point Museum is devoted to Long Island geology and prehistory. The Long Island Maritime Museum sails through sea history. Joseph Lloyd Manor is restored to its pre-revolutionary high style. The museums at Stony Brook feature a famed carriage and art collection. Old Bethpage Village has a score of historic buildings moved to that site. Old Westbury Gardens mixes Georgian architecture and English gardens. The Sag Harbor Whaling Museum returns to the tall ship days. Sagamore Hill was the summer White House of Theodore Roosevelt. The Vanderbilt Museum and Planetarium features the collections of William K. Vanderbilt. The William Floyd Estate is the birthplace of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And the Walt Whitman House is the 19th century home of the good gray poet. We're discussing a very hot subject, Long Island beaches and resorts. In that regard, here's a very important point, a crucial point, Montauk Point. Montauk, the end of the day at the end of the island. It's the point that reaches out to the ocean, and history in turn has often reached out to this old town. First, Roosevelt's Rough Riders had some of their roughest times here. They were housed at Camp Wyckoff, really quarantined, when they returned from the Spanish-American War with yellow fever. 25,000 arrived from Cuba, and Roosevelt, that roughest of riders, did admit the time we spent in Montauk was very pleasant indeed. Less pleasant was an experience during World War II, when German saboteurs landed by sub close to Montauk, stopped to bury explosives, uniforms, and dollars, and set out to assault the bridges, railroads, and reservoirs of America. They were caught when spotted from an American beach bunker, a bunker, interestingly, that's become part of a beach house and, through creative recycling, is now a bar off someone's living room. Then there was the plan for more elaborate good times. Carl Fisher had created Miami Beach and decided that Montauk and his grand Montauk Manor would be the Miami Beach of the North. He spent over $1 million on 200 luxury rooms, with luxury pool, courts, and golf course, and service just as luxurious. But the Depression depressed him to bankruptcy. So now, the manor, still topping a mountain, is a condominium, and the office tower he built to bring businesses is known affectionately as the White Elephant. It's fishes, though, not elephants, that later contributed to Montauk's fame. Here was the home of Frank Mundez, the shark killer model for Captain Quint of Jaws. He later retired to Hawaii. Here was where an 819-pound tuna was caught, enough to feed the whole Montauk Manor in the old days. And finally, of course, here is the famous Montauk Lighthouse, which has lost much ground since it was commissioned by Washington, and is trying to buy back that ground, but always with a very sunny disposition. Location, 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 the realtors say, and location was the key to Montauk's 333-year history. Now, when we think of Montauk, we sometimes think of rough seas, but Rough Riders, that is a switch. Speaking of switch, let's move to another world-class resort spot, the Hamptons. East Hampton, in particular, is known for more than just vacationing. If Montauk is the end of the island, East Hampton is known for beginnings. You'll probably pass by the pond coming into East Hampton. The spot seems Eden-like, which is only appropriate. The town is one of the first on the island, and many firsts make it worth stopping in this old town. Its idyllic landscape drew painters, creating one of the first and most famous artist colonies. In the days of Moran in the 19th century, art was taught and created along earthen roads. Then came de Kooning, Pollock in the grass, Krasner in the same house, and along the now concrete roads, Dash, Osario, LaSalle, a town teeming with artists and writers. Then you'll see the first in education, the Clinton Academy. Founded by Reverend Samuel Buell, it was the first secondary school in the state. One paid by bringing firewood to study 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Or one could pay by the subject, from $1.50 for reading to $5 for dead languages. Perhaps they were more valuable because they were dead. The town also holds the earliest remaining barn at left, a part of the Mulford Farm. The house is so old they studied paint dating there and found beneath the layers that early colonials just loved catchy colors. One key legend was about Samuel Mulford himself, who took this trunk on a voyage to England where he staved off thieves by lining his pockets with fishing hooks. The king liked that idea so much, he decided to ease East Hampton taxes. Down the road is a spookier first. One of the first and only witch trials on Long Island centered on this house. Elizabeth Gardner lived and died here, accusing Goody Garlick of haunting her sickbed before she died. Placed on trial, Goody Garlick was acquitted and was offered refuge on Gardner's Island, owned by the dead woman's father. Finally, in the Payne House, you'll find a first in music, that is, first on an old hit parade. John Howard Payne grew up in East Hampton and became a man of the theater. One of his bigger plays was Clary, and its biggest hit was the theme song based on his boyhood town. Home Sweet Home was its name, was its refrain, and was his fame for decades on end. And after 345 years, Payne's words about East Hampton still ring true. Mid pleasures and palaces, though I may roam, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. Finally, a name that's nearly as famous to vacationers, Fire Island. It's known for its serene natural beauty, and we'll visit a spot, a meadow, that's perhaps the most serene and most beautiful. But less known is its stormy side, its tragic side, and we will start with that part of Fire Island history. Fire Island. These days it beckons for rest and recreation, but the past has been much more turbulent for its old towns. It received its fiery name from fires set by early whalers or perhaps by later pirates, making ships think it was the mainland so they could be ambushed. But it was water, not fire, that brought the most violence. The entire length of the island was dotted by shipwrecks, so much so that one book dubbed it Wreck Valley. The headlines lashed by furiously, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Glucuff ran aground, the first oil tanker ever to wreck. The Peter Rickmers broke up, leaving its distinctive figurehead. The troop carrier Northern Pacific needed rescue during World War I. And perhaps most famous, author and orator Margaret Fuller went down with her husband and infant son shouting, "I see nothing but death before me," just off Point of Woods. Some ships, like the San Diego, 95 feet down, are favorites of divers. Others, so it's said, hold the stuff dreams are made of, prompting maps and myths of treasure buried off the Fire Island coast. But experts have said myth is the appropriate word.
Whereas on the Florida coast you had treasure ships with gold, silver, bullion, coins, etc. You find very, very little of that along the South Shore of Long Island. It really doesn't exist.
The treasures that did exist were vacationers, and that began with the famous Surf Hotel, hosting 500 guests, which over community protest later became a state quarantine for cholera, and then Long Island's first state park, now Robert Moses Park. And yet, it's a forest, not a park, that may be nature's unique spot on the island. Between two sand dunes, its top sheared by the wind, is the sunken forest. Walk below and you sink into another world, the largest holly garden in the eastern U.S., trees and plants and grasses centuries old, a mass of gnarled and knotted strands that weave at the top to form a canopy, a magical canopy. So for 99 years, from sunken ships to sunken forest, the history of Fire Island has been deep and dense. And that should be enough sand for one show, unmatched perhaps since Gilligan's Island. We will filter that sand, look at it a little more closely when we return. To do that, we'll be joined by the director of the Suffolk County Historical Society, Wally Broge. We'll be back in a few grains of the hourglass. here are places to look for more information on Long Island history. Not all of these books, videos, and periodicals are in current distribution, but all are available at local libraries. Welcome back. We have been looking at the resort towns of Long Island, really just 5 among the very many. And of course, we'd like to know why there were so many, where some of them went, and other question marks in the sand. To help find those answers, we are joined by Wally Broge. He is the director of the Suffolk County Historical Society. Wally, thanks for being here.
Hi, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me begin with asking you about the appeal of all these Long Island resorts. What made them so interesting? I know there were people from Brooklyn, for example, who came all the way to Long Island despite having Coney Island nearby. Why?
Well, I think, first of all, the South Shore of Long Island has world-class beaches. There's no doubt about it that some of the most beautiful beaches in the world are on the South Shore of Long Island. During the mid-19th century and the early 20th century, a very popular theory came into being that fresh air, the seashore, salt water were extremely healthy. People became very much aware of that, so they flocked to the seashore.
Perfect theory for Long Island.
Yes. They also wanted to get out of New York City. New York City was rapidly becoming an industrial center. It was becoming crowded. It was beginning to develop big city problems. People wanted to get away from the city. However, they were very much transportation dependent. During this period, privately owned motor vehicles had not really come into vogue, so the beaches and resort areas tended to develop around areas that, for the most part, the railroad could take them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a lot of the Long Island effort was centered on promotion. The name Hal Fullerton, for example, I think is linked to a lot of promotional schemes. Tell us about that a little bit. How did Long Island help itself in terms of promotion?
Well, in fact, the Long Island Railroad, as it turns out, was probably one of the biggest promoters of Long Island. Now, Fullerton came on the picture about 1897, a little bit after the beach resorts began to develop. But Fullerton's role as a special agent for the Long Island Railroad was to promote Long Island. And it was really a self-serving thing for the Long Island Railroad because during this particular period, the railroad, or just prior to this period, the Long Island Railroad came into being actually 150 years ago this year for the sole purpose really of moving passengers from New York City out to Orient Point and on to Boston and Connecticut. When the rail link was complete from Boston to New York City on the mainland, the Long Island Railroad had to begin searching for a way to make itself become economically viable. And in fact, it was just about bankrupt during the 19th century. So Fullerton came on the picture as a special agent. Fullerton was hired to promote the wonders of Long Island. He certainly focused on those big resorts, on beaches. He also focused on industries. He promoted agriculture also with the idea that farmers would move their produce on the Long Island Railroad.
And bicycling, I remember in particular, too.
Bicycling,
Mile a Minute Murphy, a whole bunch of promotional devices.
And that leads into something else, of course, that you showed in one of your earlier shows, and again just a few minutes ago. Road improvements were really critical to Long Island's development. Although the railroad played a very important part in bringing and increasing the population and bringing tourists to Long Island, it wasn't until the roads were improved that people like Robert Moses came on the scene and began developing our network of highways also. Fullerton wasn't so much interested in automobiles as he was in bicycling, but the need for roads was there, and as the roads were improved for bicycles, we were able to begin riding automobiles on them too.
Now, we've talked a lot about the South Shore, and we haven't really talked about the North Shore. What was going on all this time with the North Shore and resorting? I think I recall seeing paddle wheelers from Glen Cove, even from Seacliff. Was there much of that kind of development on the other side?
Yes, there was, but it's my understanding that the grand hotels didn't develop on the North Shore. When I think of the North Shore of the island, I think more about great estates, the Gold Coast and Nassau County, and some smaller estates also. During the same period, during the late 19th century, as the great resort hotels were developing, we also had an estate era taking place here on Long Island, and some of these huge estates were built by millionaires on the North Shore of Long Island and also a little bit further toward the middle of the island. At the same time, some communities that were very near railroad spurs from the Long Island Railroad developed, and there were smaller plots of land, certainly well-to-do people, but they had no agricultural or tourist connection. There was no income that was produced by the land. So it's my feeling that the North Shore became much more residential than the South Shore.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you have residential in the north and resort in the south.
Yes.
That's the way it developed. And still to this day, if you look at the North Fork versus the South Fork way out, there's certainly much more resorting going on in the South Shore than there is in the South Fork rather than the North Fork. Let's talk a little bit about people who oppose this kind of development, because not everybody is for it or was for it. Some people thought it was counterproductive. And these days, to bring it up to modern times, you have towns like Southold where there really is quite a movement against that kind of development. Why was that, and what sort of logic and reasoning did these forces use?
Well, even back to the period of Robert Moses, when Moses was opening up the highway network here on Long Island, there was a considerable amount of opposition to the highway development because a lot of people on Long Island thought that was going to bring on unbridled development. The population was going to grow, and they didn't want that. And that feeling still does prevail in many communities. It's interesting that you mentioned Southold. Southold is a little bit east of where I live, and it's a wonderful community. I think that rather than being opposed to development, the people in Southold like to think that they're looking toward having planned development, rather than what some refer to as unplanned development that may have taken place in the western towns in Suffolk County or in Nassau County. But there still is a good deal of opposition to new business, particularly in this case it was a McDonald's restaurant, a fast food restaurant that the residents voted down. There was heated discussion for some time, and I think that still does prevail. For many years there was talk, for example, about extending and enlarging Sunrise Highway on the South Shore, and that too was opposed.
Now, what's happened to all of these resort hotels, in general to the vacationing on Long Island? Obviously, we have a lot of it still, but we don't have all that we had, let's say, turn of the century, up and down the coast. What happened to it?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I believe that most historians feel that it was very much tied to rapidly changing economic conditions during the period. During the early 20th century, a number of things happened to affect the amount of usable, disposable money that people had to spend. Income tax, for example, began in 1916.
That'll do it.
In 1930, I believe in 1932, the gift tax laws went into effect. Properties were reassessed. Property tax values went up. Also, immigration laws changed during that period that affected the way people were able to procure immigrant labor. There was a large workforce of immigrants during the late 19th century and the early 20th century that were available to work in these great resorts and also in the estates. And of course, the Depression probably spelled the death knell to a number of those great hotels.
And I guess one other thing that also spelled the death knell, that was the opponent of these hotels, was very simply fire. I remember seeing, for example, a picture of the old Manhasset Hotel on Shelter Island, which I think was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, just going up in flames in a very dramatic scene. Did that happen often?
I'm sure that did. That was probably the fate of most of those hotels. They were all wood frame. It's hard to believe that a fire could have been effectively fought out there. And you're correct. They were huge. Some of these hotels boasted having 1,200 linear feet of facade. I mean, it's when you look at the photographs of them, they must have been, they were awesome, really, and it would have been fascinating to have been able to see them. They must have gone up in smoke in no time.
Yeah. We've talked some in the pieces about Robert Moses, and I guess we should talk a little bit more. After all, as the Long Island Parks Commissioner, he probably, more than any other person, was responsible for the vacation spots around Long Island and providing them. How do you see Moses in some sort of perspective?
Well, I can see Robert Moses in several different lights. As you point out, he was commissioner of the Long Island, he was president of the Long Island Parks Commission, And he had a great vision of opening up parkland and public land for Long Island. And during his term of office, I believe 13 parks were opened up. About 40,000 square acres were identified as possible parkland, and a number of parkway systems were opened up. On that side, I think that had a very positive effect on Long Island. The parkways he built were beautiful. I enjoyed driving them. The beaches, the parks are unparalleled. On the other hand, he was a strong proponent of the use of privately owned motor vehicles as opposed to mass transportation, and that didn't seem to work out. Dating back into the 17th century on Long Island, there were traffic problems.
And I guess because he was a man without a car who couldn't drive, he was much easier and accepting of that kind of problem. Wally, thanks very much. We thank you for shining some light on these sunny spots of Long Island. We thank you, the audience, for sitting inside and watching the sunny spots that we brought you. And our thanks to those who helped create this Old Town Collector's Edition.